Hey everyone, it's Mr. Wildboy94. I hope you're doing well today. This is probably going to be the beginning of a longer, more in-depth review series here on the channel. I don't read books very fast. I guess I could if I wanted to. I just don't really have the most amount of time I possibly can to review books. I like to take my time when I do reviews, and this whole rushing through thing or trying on the other hand to edit videos isn't really for me. I don't really have a fun time doing that. It takes up a lot more time than what I actually want to dedicate to movie making, or review making, with videos. I love YouTube. I don't really find it something I want to do for a living unless I possibly could at some point. But overall, I just really like making videos and talking with you guys about books and specifically horror. That's my big thing. I know there for a while I was trying some comic book reviews here, and maybe I'll review a little bit of that at some point. But of course I have a horror comic book review playlist here on my channel as well, in case you want to check that out at some point. All I have in there right now is a Freddy Krueger comic book review. It was a 2-issue miniseries that had started up and it didn't last whatsoever. Anyway, today I'm going to be doing a book review for Whistling Past the Graveyard from one of my used to be my favorite writer, now one of my favorite horror writers of all time when he's doing horror. He doesn't do it very much anymore. And that would be Jonathan Mayberry. The whole title is actually Whistling Past the Graveyard and Other Stories. This one is just a short story anthology collection, whatever you'd like to call it. I am a major Mayberry fan. I started off reading the Jonathan Mayberry's Pine Deep Trilogy series, which is consistent of Ghost Road Blues, his first ever fictional novel, as far as we know. It won him a Bram Stoker Award. I'll put that to the side for right now until I kind of go through my list of books I've read from him. I've read most things that Mayberry has written. Not all of it, but close to quite a bit of it. I've read comic books from him. I've read miniseries he ran for Marvel in the past. I don't think he's done any DC work. But I started off with the Pine Deep Trilogy, which starts off, like I said, with Ghost Road Blues, then Dead Man's Song. The other part of the trilogy is called Bad Moon Rising, and they're fantastic. It's one of the best Halloween stories I've ever read. It's one of the best supernatural stories I've ever read in my life. Apparently there's a moth in here. He just flew by my head. Off camera, of course. Must be because I'm crazy. Anyway, I think it's kind of interesting because Mayberry always knows how to really pluck my nerves, but he also knows how to write characters really well. And like I said, nowadays he's not really doing horror. He's doing more of like thriller type of stuff. And a lot of sci-fi type stuff, a lot of comic book stuff. There he went. You saw that. I saw him on camera, man. Get out of here. Get out of here. I think I got him. I don't know if I swatted him or he just kind of crashed and burned, but anyway, I hope he's dead. Not Mayberry, the moth, whatever that thing is. Anyway, so I've read some other stuff from him. Probably my second favorite behind the Pine Deep Trilogy series that I love so much from him is called Rot and Ruin. It's a young adult series, YA. Not a big fan of YA. I might check out some things here and there in the future, but for the most part I'm not a big YA guy. But Rot and Ruin is freaking fantastic. It's so good. It's scary, it's funny, it's fun, it's adventurous. It's not your typical YA fare. It's a zombie apocalypse story. The guy puts out some great stuff. He has a series called Joe Ledger, which is kind of his more recurring once a year or twice a year sometimes, from what I understand, type of series. It's kind of, the way he described it back in the day was 24 meets Fringe, and I think it's the best way to explain it. It's kind of like using a real straight up as close to reality as you possibly could science to explain things like zombies or this or that, following a character named Joe Ledger who gets signed up with a particular branch of the government that's kind of secretive, not really announced to the public, called the DMS, the Department of Military Sciences. And those books have a lot to offer. I've read like the first 5 or 6. Whatever the last kind of sequel to Patient Zero, which is the first book of the series. This other one's like Code Zero or something like that. I haven't read that one. That was the last one I started to pick up and I bought it and I never read the rest. I did just have a big Labor Day weekend vacation for about 4 or 5 days, and I picked up a lot of stuff from Books A Million and from some other places too out in Tennessee. So I have some great stuff to show you in a book haul hopefully tomorrow if I get a chance to, or not tomorrow, but whenever I can, you'll see. Really excited to make some videos based around that book haul and talk about a couple of stories around Tennessee and how much I love Tennessee. Anyway, Mayberry, I love him a lot. He does the Fall of Night series, which is a zombie series that kind of touches on the Joe Ledger series just slightly. It also kind of combines itself a little bit with Rot and Ruin as its own little universe, if you will. I'm a big Mayberry fan, as you can tell. I could talk all day long about Mayberry's work, recommend things all day long. I've even read and reviewed here on the channel the first book of the Limbus Inc. series, which he edited the first volume. I don't think he... No, he did write a short story for that. I forgot that he did a short story for that. It wasn't a great book, but it had some good things in there I really enjoyed. Mayberry is not great with anthologies. I'm noticing more and more as I reread some of his old short stories that he put out. He's not really great with short stories, particularly. He's one of the writers that I talk about here on the channel quite a bit. If you've watched a lot of my content, you probably know what I'm talking about. Where you have writers out here who are either really, really good with long fiction or really, really good with short fiction, and when they try the opposite, they lack quite a bit. H.P. Lovecraft, great example. Short story master. Even for his time, people were putting out bigger books. Before his time, people were putting out bigger books. Lovecraft couldn't pull that off. Not really. He could put off a 20-page story, even a 5 or 10-page story. Would really get under your skin. It really works out really well. Mayberry does better with longer fiction, in my opinion. Even though you have the weaker books that I've read from him, like in the Joe Ledger series sometimes, when he does straight-up, out-and-out horror, he pulls it off really well. This book, Whistling Past the Graveyard, it ain't perfect, honestly. It's a little bit of a hit and miss. There's a lot of weird things to have to say about it. Some of it's going to hit more if you're a fan of Mayberry and other properties out here that he's also doing short stories for in the book. I'm going to kind of go through these and pick out certain things to talk about. Probably won't talk about every story in the book, but, you know, it is what it is. Let's start off with the first one in here. First story in here is called Dr. Nine. Dr. Nine was a short story that was published way, way, way back in the day. Mayberry's first book, Ghost Road Blues, his fictional first book, the Bram Stoker Award winner for him. He's won many of those, by the way. That first one, I think this story is one of the earliest ones he wrote. And he kind of puts a little introduction to each story when he puts it out here in the book for you. So you get cool little things like that. By the way, the book is about 350 pages long. Yeah, about 350. This hardcover smells horrible. What's up with that? It smells really bad, and I don't like the texture of the actual book inside of there when you take the slipcover off. It just feels very rubbery. I couldn't get a good grip on it when I was holding the book to read it. I don't know what it was with that. It just really was gross. I don't know. I don't like that. Anyway, Dr. Nine is a very odd story that ties in kind of with the last story in this book too, called Ink, which also tied into 2 novels that recently came out. He put out a book called Glimpse, an actual novel that had been like his first horror novel in a while. And I loved Glimpse. I thought Glimpse was a fantastic read. It was such a good, not really a David Cronenberg type thing, but if Cronenberg was going to start adapting books into horror movies, that would be the one that I would be like, that would be the one Cronenberg would do. I really like it. If you like kind of Cronenberg-esque type things without so much body horror, which is kind of what defines Cronenberg, but if you like the feel of his stories, the way he tells stories, Mayberry does that well. Mayberry is like a very soft-spoken Stephen King. He doesn't go on and on and on for rambles like I and Mayberry do, or King does, but he really hits the mark the way he needs to, really pulls off characters, really gives you that impact that you need, and in Glimpse he did that. Now there's a sequel novel, it's kind of a spin-off more than a sequel, called Ink, based on, again, a character in Glimpse that shows up at the end of this book in the last story called Ink. That novel's based on this short story in here called Ink. And I'll talk more about that later on. But Dr. Nine is what was the inspiration for the novel Glimpse, and I really liked the direction we went with that. I think there were some interesting things in that novel. Now, reading this short story many years later, mind you, I had a Nook back in the day. I still have my Nook around the house, but I had a Nook back in the day that I used to watch, read different, short stories from Mayberry when I would see announcements on like his Twitter when I was still kind of touching around on Twitter back in the day before I realized what a trash heap Twitter is. I was using it a little bit, and I would read certain short stories of his, like the Joe Ledger short stories. There's a prequel to Patient Zero that he put out, all kinds of cool stuff like that. And there was one called Dr. Nine, and I remember there's a cover of that thing where a girl is kind of to herself, kind of got her knees up and everything against her chest, kind of tucked away in a corner. There's like a shadow drifting over her in like a wooden house or a wooden room or something. I don't remember exactly what the cover looked like. But I remember I always thought that cover was really good, and then the short story was okay. And then this time I read it, and I was like, the short story is still okay. It's kind of a weak thing to start this book off with. If someone's going to pick up your book and read like the first 20 pages, or in this case, the first short story in your collection, I don't think Dr. Nine was the hook you needed. I think it would have worked better if you had put this side by side with Ink, the last story of the book I keep mentioning, and kind of made a little reference like, hey, this is kind of tied together in the same universe, you know. Let's just explain that a little bit. I think this is the first ever Mayberry short story collection that's ever been released. I might be wrong about that. When Through the Fence might be the first collection he put out, but right before this or right after this. I'm pretty sure those two books came out around the same time. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty confident that's the case. I am a Mayberry collector. I do want to pick up When Through the Fence at some point. Maybe get it for Christmas. I don't really know yet. But moving along, after that story about Dr. Nine and the girl who, by the way, Glimpse is kind of focused on that character from that book. Dr. Nine's pretty much about a girl who is communicating with some kind of weird entity called Dr. Nine. And I don't want to tell you too much about it. I don't remember entirely everything about it. If you don't remember, when I was reading Swan Song, I was reading this at the same time. And I had my wisdom teeth pulled. I tried my best to review Swan Song on a video. And I think a lot of people appreciated the review. I've gotten a lot of good feedback on that review. But for the most part, I was just a drugged mess when that happened because of the drugs the doctor had me on. Not because of personal recreational drugs. I've never done that in my life. That was a mess. It was a horrible, horrible mess. Anyway, I tried my best to get through this. I finished it literally like the day after I got my wisdom teeth pulled, and I made the Swan Song review, I believe is what it was. I think it was the next day I read this and finished it. No, I didn't finish it. I read quite a big chunk of it, a couple of hundred pages of it. And then I got like over to, you know, we had to move into our new house, which is this one here, where we're at now, which I don't think I've shown this to you guys yet here on the channel, the 50 of you who've subscribed here. This is the new house. I have a setup downstairs that I use for Michael Goosebumps fan, but when my wife is off work or when she's home or whatever, I try to leave that room and just kind of record up here. So you might see me switch around where I review at in the house. It could be one of these two spots. But that's pretty much where I'm going to be at for right now, is right here. I like my longer reviews. I like the quiet. I like all those things. It's kind of hot up here, though, dude. We have an old house. We have like a 1950s house, so it's a little hot. I got a vent right here behind my booty, so I'm hoping that kind of cools all of us off in here. When I say all of us, I mean me. Anyway, moving along to the next story in here. Since I had read Dr. Nine, when I got my wisdom teeth pulled, I decided to read this story instead. After I finished up Dr. Nine and kind of put the book to a side for a little bit. The Adventures of the Greenbrier Ghost, a Sherlock Holmes story. This is one of those infamous attempts to take Sherlock Holmes, not that Arthur Conan Doyle didn't do this, but this is one of those infamous attempts to take Sherlock Holmes and pit him against an actual supernatural force. Now, the old Sheldon Reynolds TV show that I love tremendously, I have that on DVD, I love it and cherish it. It's so good, it's so fun and scary and adventurous. It's funny most of the time. The casting was perfect for that show. I watched it one whole time, like as soon as I got it in the mail. It's like 35 episodes long, 25, something like that. Kind of a short season, didn't last very long on TV, which kind of surprises me. But it's a great, great, great show, a great Sherlock Holmes show, great adaptation of a lot of episodes and stuff, and of adaptation of the old short stories from Doyle. And Mayberry tries this whole technique once again of trying to pit Sherlock Holmes against a supernatural force. A woman who has a murdered daughter. Excuse me, I haven't drank much water today. I'm kind of, I guess, just slurring my speech or something. I don't know. It's like I had a stroke when I didn't drink enough water. I don't know, it's weird. And it's not really, the writing style's not the problem. Mayberry, if he's writing Spider-Man for Marvel, for example, he does a great job of capturing that feeling of Spider-Man when he's in the costume and he's very cocky, making comments and jokes and whatnot, versus when Peter Parker is himself walking around on the street as a civilian. You have to be able to mimic how a character thinks and speaks. And Mayberry can do that, but he also can mimic how another writer wrote a story. Of course, with Sherlock Holmes, I've just started getting into that recently, this last year or so. And one of the things I noticed is that most of those stories, from what I've read so far, are written from Watson's perspective, writing about, Sherlock and telling the stories of what's happened with them. I read the first two actual novels, which they're short, but I read the first two. The first one I really enjoyed. I'd give it like a 4 out of 5 stars. If I review it sometime, I'll talk about it. The second story was a horrible, terrible, boring mess. I hated it. I haven't read Sherlock Holmes since. The next book was going to be like a short story collection. I think when they get out of my face, I thought you died, you little scumbag. It comes right back. Mayberry does such a good job of mimicking not only how Watson speaks, or even how he speaks of Sherlock Holmes, but how Sherlock Holmes speaks. He also masters how Arthur Conan Doyle wrote. He feels like he's writing as if Doyle wrote the story. Mayberry is a master of that. He can really pull that off, and he does it here, as a matter of fact. I really, really like what he did here. it works. He does such a good job with it. I really enjoy that. The story's ending is really lackluster. It's one of those great examples of why I don't like the whole idea of Sherlock Holmes versus really actual possible supernatural being or entity. It never turns out really well, and the only time I've ever seen it pulled off well in any kind of incarnation of Sherlock Holmes is when I saw the Sheldon Reynolds show. They did a couple of episodes of the same exact type of thing that were kind of similar to themselves with those 2 episodes. But still, they pulled it off. It worked well. It was scary. It was creepy. It was something to watch during Halloween time. This October, you should check out the Sheldon Reynolds show. Watch some of those scarier episodes, like the Haunted House episode or whatever. They're mysteries, but they have some ghost issue things to them that are pretty fun. This short story, it's not one of the greatest. It is another older short story that I read back in the day, like with Dr. Nine. There's a couple of stories in here that I've read before that I'll talk about a little bit. And that's one of them. And I would think out of all of the ones I've read before that are collected here, that's probably the best one. I'll be honest with you. Well, there is one I consider better, but we'll get there. That one's okay. The next one here is Calling Death. I don't remember anything about that story. Flint and Steel, a story of G.I. Joe. Okay, so this story and the next one are going to be ones that are going to be kind of off-putting to, I think, a lot of readers here. So the extent of G.I. Joe knowledge that I have, as much of a nerd and a geek as I am, I know maybe a few handful of episodes. I don't remember the details of the plot or anything. I just remember that I saw a few of the old 80s TV show episodes on reruns on Cartoon Network when I was a kid, alongside the Superman the Animated Series from 1993 or 4, or whatever the time that show came out with Tim Daly playing Superman. I think it's Tim Daly. Loved that show, grew up on that one. Seeing a little bit of that G.I. Joe show mixed in there sometimes too. I liked when I saw. I don't remember anything about it. I remember it's basically like G1 of Transformers. It's just cool cartoon to make toys for. That's really all I remember it being. And I don't remember as much sci-fi apparently as there is. And then I saw the Channing Tatum movie. I haven't seen the second one, just the first one. Was not a fan. It was terrible. And that's all I know about G.I. Joe. I don't think, even out of my uncle's comic book collection, I don't know if he had any G.I. Joe. I don't think I've ever read any G.I. Joe. This is my first ever G.I. Joe literature that I've ever read. I did not know anyone here but the small mention of Duke and the small mentions of Cobra. You know, that's about it. I'm going to be honest with you. This is one of those things that I have a big complaint with this book. It kind of goes different ways. Do not make this your first Jonathan Mayberry book. Just like I talked about in the Brian Keene book I reviewed recently too, called Turn the Page. Don't make that your first Brian Keene book. You need to be an already big fan of his to get into that, because a lot of the stuff relates to a lot of his other work out here, which is a stupid idea to publish those things without having like a connection to that book series you're talking to, or talking about. In this case, Mayberry, a lot of the time in this particular book, Whistling Past the Graveyard, you have an issue with him writing stories for properties that I don't care whatsoever about. This one is the first one, the next one is John Carter of Mars, the next story after this one. And this story is supposed to be this big revelatory thing. I don't know anything about G.I. Joe. So the stuff that they're facing here in these fights and battles and stuff, I don't know what they're talking about. I don't know what they have seen before and what they haven't seen before. I don't understand what they've come across yet. What is there a different era of G.I. Joe? Or are there different eras? Like there's different Star Wars eras, like the prequel era, the series or the sequel series, all that other stuff. Are there eras to G.I. Joe? Is there the animated series era and then the Channing Tatum era? Like, what do we have here, man? I don't get it. Flint and Steel, a story of G.I. Joe, is kind of like a mech drone thing, fight war thing. I don't know how to explain it. I wasn't impressed whatsoever. I did not like that one. It was boring. It had some cool gore and action in it when it had that, but a big chunk of this was talking. Mind you, this story starts on page 63 and doesn't end until page 123. It goes on for almost 80 pages. This story and the story after it, the John Carter of Mars story I'll talk about in a moment too, they just go on and on and on about characters and worlds and situations that I don't understand what I'm paying attention to here. I have no interest in it whatsoever. It just doesn't appeal to me. I hate to say that because I love Mayberry. I love Mayberry. He's a great writer. It's just this doesn't work. You know, it doesn't work because you have to be a G.I. Joe fan to appreciate that story. And that might have not been Mayberry's goal. Mayberry's goal might have been, I want you to read this and really like it because I wrote it. You're a fan of me. And I hope that's what he was going for. And maybe even to encourage you into checking out G.I. Joe stuff. They didn't do that for me. It made me want to avoid it because it made my head hurt. And the same thing for the next story I talked about. This one is called Death Song of Dwar Guntha, a story of John Carter of Mars. This one, I have, literally, you know my knowledge of G.I. Joe I just told you about? I have absolutely zero, zero knowledge of John Carter of Mars. I haven't seen any of the films or the film that came out. I have no idea about the stories, the novels, short stories, novellas, nothing. I don't know nothing about this series. And this story wasn't even about John Carter of Mars. It was about this Dwar Guntha guy. I don't even know if that's a previously established character of that lore. I don't know, and I don't care. And that story starts on page 123 and ends on 139. So that one wasn't as long, but it felt long. Both of those stories felt extremely long. They just kept going and going and going, very much like my review, and bored the tears out of me to where I couldn't stand it. It sucked. I hated both of those stories. They were back to back, man. The next story was called Choke Point. I don't remember anything about that. Some of these stories tie into Fall of Night, which I talked about. It's a zombie apocalypse, world-ending type of story. Those weren't so great. They were kind of a mixture of Jonathan Mayberry's, I'm talking about the series Fall of Night, the first book I read. I haven't read the second or third yet. But the first book, Fall of Night, was kind of a mixture of Jonathan Mayberry's horror roots with the Pine Deep trilogy, mixed more so with the Joe Ledger series and that thriller aspect. Not really a sci-fi aspect, more of a thriller aspect. But once again, with that series, Mayberry had done something really cool with zombies. The zombies could see what they were doing, but they had no control over themselves. They were people inside of their bodies. It was almost like they were possessed, but they were possessing themselves. Does that make sense? It's like they were inside of their bodies still and could see themselves eating people, but they couldn't do anything to stop themselves. It's like some kind of parasite took over, you know? And I thought it was great. It was a great idea for a zombie takeover. Really cool zombie storyline, and Mayberry always pulls stuff like that off. He knows how to change things up just like Jonathan Mayberry, or Brian Keene does. Brian Keene can pull this off too. He can take a concept like zombies and put a fresh spin on it. And it works. He does really well at that. This is a great example of these couple of stories in here tying to Fall of Night specifically. I think there was 2 or 3 of them, something like that. But those stories tying to the Fall of Night series were pretty solid. I didn't hate them. I think there was like one that was weaker than the others, but they were pretty good. They were kind of the beginnings of this book is getting better now. For me personally. It took about half of this book to be over with, out of the 350 pages in here, for me to start getting invested in any story whatsoever. As much as I love Mayberry, that's sad, you know? And his writing style, he's so good at adapting to different writing styles, whether it be copying Doyle or copying whoever created John Carter of Mars. I don't remember what his name was. I know he's famous worldwide, but I don't know anything about it. I don't know. He's good at being able to write in different writing styles, and he does his best here to pull this off too. Now, Clean Sweeps is a story here. Clean Sweeps is a sci-fi story, just straight up sci-fi. This is one of those old short stories that was published way back in the day. On my Nook, I read it. And I remember, God, my throat's dry. I remember, for whatever reason, being so blown away by the ending of that story because of the message that it had. It was like the first time I ever really understood that there was political commentary. Sort of, kind of, not bias, but just political commentary in a story or a movie or anything that I had seen before. And when I saw that this time, when I read that story again this time, just to see what it felt like this time around, it's a very short story. When I read that this time, I was kind of surprised that I was not as into this one. I didn't like that one. It didn't do well. It just didn't hit me the right way this time. It just didn't work. It kind of sucked. It felt like an author's first time writing anything. And I didn't realize how bad it was until this time around. Even the plot twist at the end sucked this time around. I don't know. It just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. So skip this one. Skip that story. Then moving along to my favorite part of the book that I did not know about. So there are 4 short stories in here that one of them I've read a long time ago when it was first published on a horror website. Some kind of literature, horror writing website that knew about Mayberry. They were promoting Mayberry. And he wrote a short story for them that was tied to the Pine Deep trilogy. Well, that's included in here, and the weird thing about it is before I bought this book, like a week or a month before I bought this book, I was thinking about how much I would love to hunt that story down and check that story out. It's called Property Condemned, and it's in this book. Now, however, there are 4 short stories back to back, starting with Long Way Home, then Mr. Pockets, then Property Condemned, the story I just talked about, and then Whistling Past the Graveyard, that are all tied to the Pine Deep trilogy. And Mayberry even mentions also in the notes that he put before those stories that he would love to come back someday and do more Pine Deep trilogy stuff. Man, that made my whole day. That made my whole day. I love Pine Deep. I talked about that at the beginning of this review. It's the first thing came out of my mouth after I talked about the title a little bit and how much I love Mayberry, was how much I love the Pine Deep trilogy. It's my favorite thing he ever put out. If you consider those 3 books, that trilogy, into one big book, which it technically is, and the time frame, the way the characters' events happen and whatnot, takes place over the course of a month. If you include that book as one big book, I would say without hesitation that the Pine Deep trilogy is my Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings are 3 big books that make one bigger book, and it's a trilogy and all that. And this is my Lord of the Rings, pretty much. I know it has less of the adventure aspect, but when you read them, you'll see what I'm talking about. The kind of mystery that's there, the kind of supernatural events that happen, the kind of scares and gore and the comedy. The characters are amazing in the Pine Deep trilogy, whether it be Crow, Val, Mike. I love them all. The villains are great. All of it. It's great. You can't pass it up, man. If you like horror, you'll love that. But I'll tell you now, these 4 short stories, I did not know I was getting them, and when I hit that point of the book, it just improved the whole book for me. At the end of my review, when I do my rating for it, you're going to see a big rating. Well, more positive than what I've sounded like so far, talking about over half of this book. Because over half of this book I don't like. I'll be honest with you. Over half of the book I don't like, or some of the stories I did like back in the day didn't hold up. Not because of knowing the spoilers or knowing the plot twists and whatnot. Not because of anything like that. Just because they didn't hold up. They weren't good compared to what Mayberry is now, these days. So the sad thing for me is that these 4 stories are so good. They're so good. I don't remember all the details of each individual one. Property Condemned, of course, is the one that I read way back in the day about a lot of our main characters from the book series of Pine Deep Trilogy being kids and going to an abandoned house, basically. And they see a mirror in this house and what it shows them about their future. And it's so good. It's so good. It holds up even now, man. It's one of the best, probably the best short story Mayberry's written, in my personal opinion. I love it. Mr. Pockets, about a guy with pockets. And he's like a homeless man. And it's a really good story. I really, really like that one. And you also have little cameos here and there of characters that you knew from those books, too, if you've read them. Long Way Home. I remember a little bit about this one. Just vaguely. I think that's the one that introduces 2 characters called Near Danny and Far Danny, which are 2 different guys named Danny, and one is taller than the other. And the reason they're called Near Danny and Far Danny is like if they're standing right here in front of you, one looks like he's really far away, and one looks like he's standing up right in front of you, because they look pretty similar, and one looks like he's really far away because he's short, and the other one looks really tall, so he looks like he's closer. You get it? You get the joke? It was better when Mayberry delivered it, okay? Whistling Past the Graveyard, I don't think I remember that story at all in here. I remember enjoying the crap out of it. I enjoyed all 4 of the Pine Deep trilogy stories. They were all magnificent. They added so much to that series, even for side characters and stuff that we were tinkering with at the time. It was great. All 4 of those short stories I loved. I thought they were a blast. They added so much to this. The events were crazy and fun and enjoyable. It was so good, man. If anything, I will recommend to you in this book, if you're a Pine Deep trilogy fan from Mayberry, pick up this book. Just as a collector, pick up this book because of those 4 short stories. They're great. They're great, great, great. I might even reread those this coming month in October, when I'm going to plan on reading the Pine Deep trilogy again for the first time in like 10 years. I read them, I want to say, in 2010 or 11, somewhere in there for the first time when I went to West Virginia for the first time. I think it was the first time I went over there. It was somewhere in that ballpark, 2010 to 12, you know? And I loved Pine Deep. I read Ghost Road Blues when I was going down there, or over there. I'm in Virginia. I was going to West Virginia to visit family. And Ghost Road Blues, man, reading that in West Virginia. I know it takes place in Pennsylvania, but that atmosphere of that area and just how quiet it is out there, it just fits so well for that storytelling, man. I can't tell you how much I love Pine Deep Trilogy. If you haven't noticed already, big advocate. Big, big, big advocate. This book alone is worth picking up for those 4 short stories if you're a fan. But again, the problem here is that if you're not already a previously established fan of Mayberry, and specifically the Pine Deep trilogy, you're not going to be able to appreciate those 4 short stories as good as they are. I don't think they're as good if you don't know those characters, or you don't know the events surrounding what these stories are relating to. It's kind of a shame. Some of them are prequels, some of them are not prequels, some of them are kind of sequels, I think, from what I vaguely remember. Some of them might take place right before that whole situation with Pine Deep Trilogy and the events that took place there on the month of October. This is the whole time that timeline takes place. I don't really know what to tell you. It's hard to recommend this to somebody who's never checked out Mayberry. If any of these stories I just mentioned to you sound interesting, which telling you that a homeless man has pockets and he's called Mr. Pockets probably doesn't sound the greatest, but the story's content was fantastic. It has a very 1980s feel to it. Could have been a great 1980s film. Something Carpenter could have made. I would recommend Pine Deep Trilogy before you'd read this. Even if you pick this up for just those 4 short stories, read the Pine Deep Trilogy's entirety before you do that. Anyway, finally moving along, there's a story called Cooked. It's the third to last story. And Cooked is basically about... it's a guy who's like a meth head or a crack addict or something. And he had a best friend he grew up with who was also addicted to drugs too. And that best friend dies, and his uncle is like into voodoo and stuff. And the main character and that uncle kind of come into contact somehow. And they decide to get revenge, I think is what it was, something like that. It was okay. I thought that, again, the dialect and the way that Mayberry wrote that uncle character, who's like, I think he's Haitian, I believe, which is kind of like that voodoo idea. It was effective, and it worked. I think that he really pulled that off. I think the accent worked. Mayberry knows how to write that, like J.K. Rowling knows how to write that. He's a professional at this. And that story was good. I don't like the ending of it. I think it was a little weak, for the most part. But overall, I liked that story. It was pretty solid. The story after that, The Death Poem of Sensei Otaru, the next to last story in this book. That was a wild ride. That was a great example of Mayberry experimenting and doing something fantastic I really enjoyed. Let me take a sip of water again. This is a long review. I'm sorry for that, but I had to make it. Personally, I'm having more fun making the video like this because I just get to chill and not have to rush and have a heart palpitation in the meantime. The Death Poem of Sensei Artoria basically is... So there's this guy. I think it's Otaru. This is kind of like a... This is Mayberry playing around with samurai. Yes, samurai in the sense of back in the day samurai existing, whether they be assassins, whether they be just a guy that's not a policeman, but just kind of a guy with a sword for defending himself. This is before the time of guns and stuff like that. So there's this guy, Otaru, who is kind of an assassin type. He's very poetic. He's also dying. And another dying man that he knows and respects in the village comes over to him and asks him to go to this island where people are coming back from the dead because of hungry ghosts, or hungry demons, as they put it. You can probably imagine where this is going. Yes, it's zombies. And as stupid as that might sound, I want to tell you, I want you to give it the benefit of the doubt. The story is very slow. The story is very slow. It starts on page 293 and ends on 328, right? It takes a while for the story to get going. Out of like the 30 or 40 pages that it is in length, it takes a good 15 or 20 pages to get the story off its feet after these characters stop having their little meeting and talking about that zombie island place. Basically, the guy who's dying that's, well thought of by Otaru, essentially he wants Otaru to go out to this place, and if he sees any family of this man, to save them, or if they've turned into the hungry ghosts or hungry demons or whatever, just kill them. Just put them out of their misery, put them down. Try to save anybody you could. And I'll tell you right now, I had my doubts reading that one. That was the one that I was like, this is going to be really hard for me to finally work my way through, because the concept sounded great. The execution's a little wonky at first because of how slow this is and how slow it builds. But I will tell you this. As soon as Otaru gets to the island, it takes off. It's fun, it's creepy, it's scary. It's really not as gory as I thought it would be, but it's gory enough that it might satisfy most zombie fans out there. It's a new take on zombies I haven't seen before. Samurai versus a bunch of zombies on an island. It was really good. It was really a solid story, and the ending was fantastic. The ending left me breathless, I'll be honest with you. I really want to know what's going to happen, and I don't now. I would love to see some kind of novel based on that story. That should be a novel, because it could have been great. Now, it works great as a short story. It just took a long time to get going, but it was a really good short story. But I would have loved to have seen a novel tied to that in some sort of way. I don't know how you'd do it. I don't know what you'd pull off for that, but you could do something really cool, Mayberry. You could do something really, really cool with this and really make something fun and adventurous. I think a lot of people would love that. That was a really good one. That was one of the best of the few standalones that stuck in here. I was really surprised I never read that one before. I'm really surprised I never heard about that one before. Compared to everything else in the book, including the Pine Deep Trilogy stories, this is a big, big, big success of a story, in my opinion. Now, the last story in here is called Ink. And I talked about this earlier. It's kind of tied to the first story in here called Dr. Nine. This one also has its own kind of spin-off novel. The character that appears in here... Man, I keep trying to clear my throat. The character that appears in here is a man who is kind of like a private detective type. And he gets tattoos. And in this case, he's talking to a guy at a tattoo parlor who is a skinhead, a neo-Nazi. This man's putting a tattoo into him, and it's kind of just vaguely a woman, right? And this tattoo artist is slowly filling in the face. And apparently this is what this main character does to try to get this man to understand that he's going to kill him for his crimes, where he raped and killed this woman. And mind you, this character from the situation that he's in, this Ink character, the one getting the tattoo, he's actually in Glimpse, right? If I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure it's the same character in Glimpse who also has his own novel called Ink. And the story here is good. Does it make sense? It's good. It's a little weak to end the book on, but it's a good story. I would love to read the novel Ink, just to see what happens there. Because again, Mayberry does better with novels than he does short stories, in my opinion, so far. This is really solid. I mean, really solid. This is a good book. Short story. This is a good short story. This has a lot to offer. Mayberry always has a lot to offer. This short story was really interesting, even though I knew I knew what would happen already because I was familiar with this character already. I liked what was happening, though. If I had not read this short story before and knew nothing about this character before and had not read Glimpse before, I would have been interested to see what would happen here. That'd be a really cool concept about tattoos and the tattoos coming to life and that kind of thing. It's really cool, and I liked it. It was cool. Again, could have been a really cool Cronenberg-type movie. It wasn't, like, gory or anything. It just had a cool building and building and building up to it for, like, a 20-page long short story. But that's pretty much the end of the whole review. The end of the book, guys. I mean, that last story is a little weak to end the book on. I wish they had had Dr. Nine and Ink side by side in this book. But I gotta tell you, this book overall is a big miss. Overall, it's a big mess. If you're not a big Mayberry fan, you're not going to love the book at all, because most of these things aren't standalone stories, and the ones who are about 95% of the time are not that good. When you have the Pine Deep Trilogy stories, the 4 of those in here, that take up a lot of space. It's like a good 50 to 60 or 70 pages based on those short stories alone. They're great, but you got to be a Pine Deep Trilogy fan specifically, not just a Mayberry fan, but a Pine Deep Trilogy fan to really get into that and really like it as much as I did, or as much as a lot of Pine Deep Trilogy fans would be. That's my favorite part of the whole book. Easily, hands down. It's what gives it the bigger rating that I'm giving it. The Fall of Night, couple of short stories, or one short story that was tied to that. That was good, from what I remember that too. The Otaru story was really good. Samurai versus Zombie Island. What could you possibly go wrong with on there, aside from being too wordy and too talkative? So dry mouth. Why? It was such a half and half mixture of a book of being good and bad. I don't really know what to tell you. It didn't hit me the right way. It just doesn't always work for me here. I just think when the first half of your book is either not good, or I've already read it before, or something like that, it can cause a lot of issues. The first half of this book overall in quality, I don't think is worth your money. The G.I. Joe The G.I. Joe short story is too much. It's boring, it's slow, I know nothing about that world, and it's lame. I didn't like it at all. And the John Carter of Mars Star Wars Gunther story, that sucked too. That was really dull. I liked a couple of things there, but it was mostly boring and dull. About a character that had nothing to do with John Carter, I didn't learn anything about him. It just doesn't work for me. Didn't like that one either. Again, first half of this book is not good. Even the moth is bored. Look, he's leaving. He's going out the door. Even that's boring. I don't really know what else to tell you. It's just a really dull book overall, which is sad because I love Mayberry. I never talk about Mayberry like this. Very rarely does Mayberry put out a bad book or a lackluster book. Lackluster is really the word I'd put out here. It has some good things in here, some really good things sometimes. Even the bad stories that have some good scenes, like the action scenes in the G.I. Joe story. Just overall, it's not always a hit and home run, man. And that's every writer. Every writer's going to do that. Not every book's going to be a success from them. And I accept that. And I hope Mayberry understands that too if he ever sees this review. I doubt he will, but if he ever does, I hope he understands that too. The parts of this book that I love, I genuinely love. The parts that I really like, I genuinely really like about it. But overall, I think it's not worth your money. I think if you're not a big fan of Mayberry, not a collector of Mayberry, not a fan of Pine Deep Trilogy, or any of the other things I've mentioned in this review, it's not going to be for you. It just won't be. It's a big miss with a big photoshopped bird. Because look at that foot, man. Tell me that ain't some crap CGI Photoshop stuff right there. Anyway, when it comes to Whistling Past the Graveyard by Jonathan Mayberry and other stories, if I had to rate this book on a 5-star basis, I'm leaning more towards a 3 out of 5 stars. And when I kept saying bigger rating earlier, it was kind of number 1 to throw you off a little bit. But number 2, mainly just to prove my point. If something is a very, very, very mixed anthology story series, book, whatever, I can't help but give it a 3 out of 5. If it has way more positives than negatives, it deserves like a 4 out of 5. This one doesn't have that. It's like half the book was actually interesting. And about a quarter of it I actually loved, you know. But for the most part, it's a big miss. It's not really for you. It's well written. All of it's mostly well written. I would say maybe a few lines here or there need to be changed. Clean Sweeps isn't written that well. Dr. Nine's a little bit of an off piece. But most of the things here are written beautifully. I love the poetic nature of that Otaru story with the zombie and the samurai thing. It's very poetic the way it's written. It's very respective, I guess, towards that Asian culture at the time. There's some great, great, great things here from Mayberry. He's a great author. It's just not perfect. It's not a perfect book. I don't expect it to be. It is what it is. It has its flaws. But I was entertained sometimes. But a lot of the time, especially when I had my wisdom teeth pulled and I was trying to work my way through this book, there was a big chunk of this book that just sucked. It just sucked. I hated a big chunk of this book, man. I remember back when I read Joe Ledger book number 4. It was the one with the vampires. And it sucked. It was terrible from what I remember of it. It might be better now. If I ever reread it, I might talk about it in a positive light. I don't know for sure. But I remember hating it. That was the first one of the Ledger series that I was like, this is a terrible mess, man. I don't know. I hope Mayberry doesn't stick with that thriller crap, because most of the time when he does that, he doesn't do it as well as he does with horror. With horror, he always hits it out of the park. With the stories in here that are typically just straight horror, he kills it. He really kills it, you know? It's just not going to be a book for everybody. It's not a book I can recommend to you, and it's definitely not a book I can say should be your first Mayberry read. And if it is, you're not going to like it. You probably won't like it, frankly. Anyway, what are your thoughts on Whistling Past the Graveyard? Did you like the book? I'd love to hear all that down below, too. Put your thoughts and comments down below, guys. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it or about my review. It's been a long, rambly one. I kind of want to make videos more like this, but still spoiler-free so you can enjoy a book and check it out and whatnot. But maybe they won't be as long and tedious as this is. This is an anthology book review, though, so what do you expect? I have to cover a lot of different things, if not everything. I'm sorry I don't remember every single story. Like that one we talked about, I don't remember what it was. I'm sorry about that. I don't know. Some of them slip my memory. It's not really worth talking about most of the time. But, yeah, that is what it is. I hope you enjoyed the review. Hope you'll check the book out if you're a Mayberry fan. But again, be a Mayberry fan before you pick this out. I hope you know some G.I. Joe. I hope you know some John Carter, because I did not, and that really heavily affected my enjoyment of this. Anyway, what are your thoughts? 3 out of 5 stars for me. Put them down below. Thank you for watching. God bless you, and goodbye.